everyone! I have a very subjective discussion today. You know, usually when I try to talk about things, I try to be as objective as I can, I try to give reasoning and stuff, and I will do that here, but the topic of this video is naturally just going to be very opinionated and personal experience based. And so, you know, I'm gonna talk about that, and keep in mind that, you know, this is gonna be very dependent on one's own personal experience, but there's three mini topics to talk about today. All of them kind of revolve around meta discussion. So, the first one is a tweet I unfortunately cannot find, but I do remember it very well. It kind of stuck with me, which was one talking about how in Splatoon 2 we dealt with like 5 years of the game, and it didn't seem like there was any major burnouts compared to what we have in Splatoon 3, where we haven't even finished 2 years yet. And like Splatoon 2 had stuff like armor and missile and ray. So how did that happen? Right? How did we possibly deal with that? And I think one thing that's important to note, and I'll kind of get back to this topic more later as well, is even though Splatoon 3 has had a pretty good meta, like, this has basically been almost an endgame state in terms of meta, in terms of the lack of changes we've had. And despite that, people are still playing and very enthusiastic about the meta a year later. That speaks to its quality. Not many metas would have lasted like this. But it's still one meta. Splatoon 2's patch history is marked by the most extreme set of changes between different metas in any of the 3 Splatoon games. It was so extreme that it's very clear the devs have pulled back to avoid that kind of thing again. And while it has a lot of negatives, one of the positives it does have is it changes something up. If you don't like the meta, it's gonna change, and it's gonna change fast. That's really important to note. Like, for example, missiles was only really a problem at the end of the game, because they weren't good enough to be a problem prior. There was like a year worth of metas where armor could be picked, but it wasn't a necessity, and a lot of teams just didn't run armor. I have no arguments for Ray. Ray was good the entire time, and it was especially broken at some metas, and had like things where you could use it in your spawn shield. We should have banned Ray. But, you know, for the rest of Splatoon 2, a lot of people look at it and think of the endgame meta, but that was only a small portion of Splatoon 2. And all of the different metas changing a lot of the time made it a lot easier for players to deal with some of the weaker attributes of the meta. Splatoon 3, on the other hand, has had much more solid metas in general. Like, not just this one, but especially this one. And so, despite the fact that we've been stuck with the same meta for about a year or so, you know, there's been changes and evolutions of it, but that's been more on the players evolving things than it has been on the patches changing things. That's something that I want to talk about a lot more when I go through the meta history of this, is most of the changes that happened in this past year are not things that happened because of a patch, with very few exceptions. Most of the time, it's just been us getting better at the game. And even then, it hasn't changed that much, obviously. The core style of it is still very similar. So I think that's one factor. Another thing that was talked about in terms of the same Burnout topic was, I believe this was a post from Fuzzy, talking about how I think that people are kind of telling on themselves when they say that the meta isn't diverse, because there's so many different things doing well, and there was a lot of different examples, most of which were from Japan, because I think Fuzzy cares a lot more about the meta in Japan than the meta in the West. And I don't think he's necessarily wrong. I think there are a lot of areas we could be using different things compared to Japan. But I think there is one thing to note in terms of weapon diversity in the meta. And this was Splatoon 2's big problem. This is what I hit Splatoon 2, because a lot of people would approach Splatoon 2 endgame meta and be like, okay, but you didn't have to run 4 shooters. There were other options that did okay with like 2 or 3 shooter. And my argument to that was, okay, but why would you ever pick those things? A lot of the fun, cool things Splatoon 2 had were just not worth the effort. And in many ways, I think this is the case with Splatoon 3 for one weapon, for pencil. Sure, you can pick non-pencil comps and do well, and win tournaments, and we see it happening. Definitely more than in Splatoon 2. But a lot of Splatoon 3 teams, especially in West, if they're going to dedicate to a solid group of 4 compared to more pickup teams, and just in general, if we're going to try to be the best team, it's going to be a lot easier to do that if we just run pencil comps, because pencil comps are a lot easier, there's a lot more flexibility between them, and it's a lot more accessible. So what we're seeing is, despite the fact that, yeah, there's non-pencil stuff that can absolutely work 100%, we're not going to see that a lot here ever with how we approach the game in the Western scene. And it could be argued that, okay, that's a problem with how we approach the game. But I also think that's a problem with the game. If you're going to have a weapon that simplifies 2 rolls down that is easier than those, and is going to be like, simpler to get used to, why would you not invest it? Splatoon teams are a long-term thing. Teams like Moonlight here that I'm looking at right now have been around for an entire year. These are long-term investments. In this case, there's a lot more that you can learn by simplifying the roles down and by having something that is going to be easier to learn. Think about how much Moonlight has been able to adapt these other 3 players. Dolan has been playing stuff like Range Blaster and Squeezer. Omega's been doing like Carbon, Wiper, Roller, Dually, Stamper. Shadow has been doing Zap, Splattershot, Splash, Neo, Tent. All these different weapons. And half the reason we could do all of these changes to adapt to all these different shifts and team styles is because the consistent pencil from Basil has always been there. If we had to adapt for that, and we can do that, and we have done that at times. I've tried stuff like Wellstring with Basil, we've done Edit, we've done, like, a bunch of other options because Shadow can play Zap. But all of those options required a much more drastic shift in what we do. As a team, that's always going to be less accessible. But the amount of adaptations we can make from running a pencil, from keeping that simpler game plan, are a lot more. And that's just always going to be something that's worth noting. You have to tone back pencil if you want this problem to be fixed. If you want people to experiment with other anchors, the gap in accessibility and power, etc., needs to be shrunk to the point where it's more worth the extra effort it provides. It's the same kind of issue where you can do all of these things. And if a team really wanted to, they could. And anyone saying they absolutely can't is wrong. But it's the effort required. It is the effort put in that changes things. Why don't we switch to the POV? It's that amount of effort that I think is where a lot of the complaints come from in terms of the meta staleness. That's where I think most of this stuff happens. It's because of that. And that brings me to another factor. The patch. We finally know that there's going to be a patch that is more than likely going to change things. The next patch is set on nerfing weapon abilities. This is finally going to be a patch looking at the very best things in the meta. We're finally going to have an update that's going to tweak stuff like this. And I've expressed a lot of concern over it. Because while I think important nerfs are a good thing right now, Nintendo has not had the best track record when it comes to nerfing powerful weapons. Right now in Splatoon 3, the only thing they've over-nerfed has been Machine, which is true. But if we look back at Splatoon 2, which isn't that far back, a lot of weapons got gutted, or got hit way too hard with nerfs. And that is not something we want to happen right now. And it's also hard to note knowing that a lot of that happened toward the end of Splatoon 2 and led to the endgame meta we don't like in that game. The endgame meta of quad shooter and a lot of different special spam happened right after a lot of nerfs to midline weapons. There's a possibility of that happening again. So there's a lot of concern there. However, I think there is one factor I want to talk about. This is where it gets a bit more personal to me. I think that I really like the state of the game. I really like where Splatoon 3 is right now, but I've also suffered from burnout a little bit. My drive as a competitive player has never been lower, and as such, I've definitely lost a bit of progress and improved a lot less. I'm not keeping up as well with the very best of players, and I'm frankly not ashamed to admit that. And I think part of this that has been interesting to me is figuring out why I feel this way. Because whenever I talk about the game or look at the game from an analytical POV, I'm very interested in it. I like the state of the game and where it is. And I have weapons that are quite good right now. So why do I feel this way? Part of it might just be motivation and how I feel about the competitive game after so much time playing it. But part of it might be something else. When I look at some stuff that we've been dealing with for a while, you know, even if they're not things that are necessarily broken, talking about dealing with pencil all the time, talking about dealing with Squeezer's absurd main weapon attributes, dealing with 52 and Wall and how that interacts with other weapons, dealing with things like Zuka. A lot of these problems are things that we've been dealing with for a while. A lot of the extreme attributes that people might not like about the game or that might be mildly annoying have been around for a while. While I personally don't think pencil's that big a deal, or 52's that big a deal, etc., stuff like Zuka might be different. It's the fact that we've been dealing with them for so long that I think really affects me. I think that is what has gotten me a bit more demotivated. Because it's the fact that I've been dealing with stuff for so long that it starts to feel a bit more irritating, even when it's stuff that isn't as extreme. And I think when I'm approaching it from an analytical POV, when I'm not a person playing the game and just observing it from a coach perspective or from watching a tournament, that doesn't bother me. Because I'm not dealing with anything. But if I'm a player, and especially this is a perspective I don't have, I've been coaching for a while. Imagine I've been on a team as a top player, dealing with Zuka, or dealing with Pencil, dealing with Squeezer, for a year or potentially more. It's gonna start to get to you a little bit more. It's gonna start to be something that annoys you a little bit more, potentially. And I think that's something that's more important to know. So, while I am still very, very scared of this patch, very worried what it's gonna do to the game, I think even if some midline weapons are toned back a bit, if it also comes with toning back some of the things that have needed to be toned back, that have been problems for a long period of time, that might help. In fact, that even brings us back to the first tweet I saw. I remember one of the replies talked about 52 specifically. I stopped playing the game, and again, I don't remember the tweet very well, but something about, like, I played the game in S2, and 52 was annoying to deal with, but now we're also dealing with 52 in a wall, having some of the same annoying attributes as it did years ago. What are we doing? And it's like, that's a fair point. Obviously, it's not the same as K52. I don't even think 52 is that big a problem, but it is a similar issue. And so if that's something you didn't like dealing with 3 years ago, you might not like dealing with it now. And I think for Squeezer, that's possibly the even bigger issue. Squeezer is a big one for me because it's been around for so long. And I think Squeezer is personally, like, a bit of a bigger one for me because not only does it exemplify some long-range pressure from Squeezer Pen being quite ridiculous, but also between issues with Wall, issues with Squeezer, and issue with Zuka, fighting Squeezer feels like this amalgamation of dealing with the game's issues, both past and current, all wrapped into one weapon. It's definitely the thing that gets to me the most. But that's all just my thoughts. And again, like I said at the start, a lot of this is very subjective. It's hard to really tell why there could be some kind of burnout. It's hard to tell what needs to be fixed. And the patch could absolutely still fuck everything up in a bad way. 100%. But I do think that I'm a little more enthusiastic for the patch because I'm at a point where, yeah, my motivation's kind of down. So, fuck it. Let's see if they'll do something that makes it better. They might mess it up. It might go horribly wrong. But maybe, just maybe, we'll have a patch that tweaks some of the things that have been bothering people for years, tones back some of the annoying parts, and we can have an evolved version of the meta we have right now that allows for new options to be used, that allows for things to be less annoying, and that opens up more possibilities for experimentation without it being locked behind a difficulty curve that makes it not worth it for long-lasting teams. You know, maybe that'll happen. I don't know.